In 1956, a small-town priest told a 21-year-old Elvis Presley that his music was the devil's work. The crowd gasped, but Elvis didn't argue. He just looked up at the crucifix above the altar and smiled. What he said next inside that Memphis church didn't just silence the room. It reshaped how the church saw music itself. August 19th, 1956, Memphis, Tennessee. The air shimmered like glass. 97 degrees, no wind, no mercy. Inside the First Assembly Church, ceiling fans spun slow, slicing the heavy heat. Sweat rolled down the wood of the pulpit. Outside, hundreds gathered on the steps, pressing their faces to the stained glass, hoping to see the boy they called Elvis the Pelvis. Inside, 200 people filled every pew, whispering, fanning, praying. The walls smelled like candle wax and cotton starch. A piano stood in the corner, its keys chipped from years of Sunday hymns. And in front of it, sitting quietly with his hands folded, was 21-year-old Elvis Presley. Black slacks, white shirt, a silver cross around his neck. He looked more like a choir boy than a rock star, but the tension in the room was thicker than the heat. Some were here to witness a miracle, others came to watch him fall. At the pulpit stood Reverend Thomas Cole, tall, grey-templed, voice like thunder. He'd preached in Memphis for 30 years and never once allowed a guitar inside his church. His sermon that morning was supposed to be about faith, but everyone knew what it was really about. He cleared his throat, his Bible trembling in his hands. "Elvis Aaron Presley," he began, "your music shakes hips that were made to kneel." A ripple of gasps swept through the pews. One woman crossed herself. Another clutched her child's hand. Elvis didn't move. His eyes stayed fixed on the cross above the altar. The Reverend went on. "You make the young forget the Lord. You turn gospel into lust." The room fell dead silent. Only the buzz of a ceiling fan and the nervous tapping of someone's shoe. Outside, fans shouted his name through the glass. Inside, no one dared breathe. Elvis's mother, Gladys, sat 2 rows back, twisting her handkerchief. She'd raised him on hymns and prayer circles, on the kind of faith that made you sing even when you were poor. She looked at her boy, torn between pride and fear. Elvis finally lifted his head. His lips parted, but he didn't speak. Instead, he smiled, small, sad, and calm. A beam of light broke through the stained glass, painting his face in red and gold. The crowd whispered like a wave. For a second, even the Reverend looked unsure. Was this young man a sinner, or something else? Then Elvis stood. The wooden floor creaked beneath his boots. Every eye followed him as he stepped toward the pulpit. The heat shimmered around him like smoke. He placed one hand on the Bible, the other over his heart. The Reverend's jaw tightened. "You came here to repent, son." Elvis's voice was low, almost gentle. "No, sir," he said. "I came here to understand." A murmur rippled across the crowd. He looked at the congregation, at the mothers, the choir boys, the fans waiting outside the glass. "Music saved me," he said. "When I had nothing, it was all I had. But if it offends the Lord," he paused. The silence grew unbearable. Then he looked back up at the cross. "Maybe I've been singing the right words in the wrong way." The crowd leaned forward, waiting. No one expected what would happen next. Elvis took one step closer to the mic stand near the pulpit. The church lights flickered. He whispered, "Maybe it's time I prove where my heart really is." The Reverend frowned. "And how will you do that, son?" Elvis smiled again, quiet, certain. "By singing for him." The air cracked with shock. Someone gasped. The piano lid creaked open, and that's when it began. Would you have stayed seated or stood with him in that moment? The piano keys trembled under his fingers. No one knew if Elvis was about to play or pray. Then Reverend Cole's voice broke through the silence like thunder. "Stop!" The echo bounced off the walls. Dust fell from the rafters. "You move like sin in motion," he said. "You lead our youth astray." Elvis froze. His hand hovered above the keys. Outside, the crowd quieted. Even through the stained glass, they could sense the tension inside. Reverend Cole stepped down from the pulpit, his shoes echoing against the floorboards. "I've seen your concerts, son. I've seen the girls faint and scream your name. That's not worship, that's temptation." Elvis didn't answer. His gaze followed a beam of light crawling up the wall to the old wooden cross. The Reverend kept talking, his voice trembling with anger and fear. "You twist the Lord's songs into noise. You shake your hips in front of children. Do you call that holy?" Elvis exhaled slowly. He could feel everyone staring, the congregation, the choir, even his mama. Gladys whispered his name, her voice cracking, but he didn't move. He remembered nights on Beale Street, the sound of blues slipping through the alleys, the harmonies of the gospel singers who made the air feel alive. It wasn't sin, he thought. It was joy. He wanted to tell the Reverend that music never made him turn away from God. It made him reach for him. But before he could speak, Cole stepped closer, pointing at him. "You've built an empire on lust, boy. You've turned passion into profit." A cold wave ran through the crowd. The young choir boy in the front row dropped his hymnal. The thud echoed like a gunshot. Elvis's fingers tightened. He felt his heartbeat in his throat. He could walk out. Let them think what they wanted. He had money, fame, fans. He didn't need anyone's approval. But something in the Reverend's eyes stopped him. A flicker of something deeper than anger. Maybe fear. So Elvis did something no one expected. He didn't defend himself. Instead, he looked straight at Reverend Cole and asked quietly, "Reverend, what if God made me this way?" The words hit the room like a crack of lightning. A woman gasped. Someone whispered, "Lord have mercy." Even Cole seemed stunned. "What did you say?" Elvis repeated it, slower this time. "What if God made me this way? What if he wanted people to feel something when they hear a song?" The Reverend blinked, speechless. Elvis took a step closer. "You say my music turns people away from God. But maybe it turns them toward him, just not the way you expect." The crowd stirred. Whispers filled the air. Elvis looked at them. Men gripping their hats, women clutching pearls, the little boy still frozen with his hymnal. He said, "If joy makes people dance, if hope makes them sing, how can that be sin?" You could hear nothing but the hum of the old lights above. Reverend Cole's mouth opened, but no words came out. Elvis didn't look angry. He looked heartbroken. "Sir," he said softly, "I ain't trying to lead nobody astray. I just sing what I feel. And if the Lord don't like it, he can take my voice away himself." The silence was unbearable. Even the ceiling fan seemed to stop. A single clap came from the back. Then another. Then half the room rose to its feet. Reverend Cole stared at the young man in front of him, the one he had just condemned, and for the first time, he hesitated. Elvis bowed his head. "I'll prove it to you, Reverend. I'll show you what music can do." His words hung in the hot, heavy air. The Reverend stepped back, unsure whether he'd just witnessed defiance or faith. And as Elvis left the church that day, the whispers followed him like smoke. Could a song really change the church itself? September sunlight spilled through the cracked window of a Memphis diner. The clatter of dishes, the hum of a jukebox, and whispers followed Elvis everywhere he went. It had been 3 days since the church confrontation. The newspapers hadn't printed the story, but everyone in town already knew. Some called him proud, others called him lost. Elvis stirred his coffee without drinking it. The spoon rang against the glass like a ticking clock. Beside him sat his old friend and driver, Charlie Hodge, reading the Memphis Gazette. The headline wasn't about Elvis, but the whispers beneath it were. "They say the Reverend might hold another sermon. Whole town's talking," Charlie muttered. Elvis nodded slowly. "Yeah, I reckon he will." Charlie folded the paper. "You gonna fight back?" Elvis looked out the window. A bus of schoolgirls passed, one waving an autograph book. "No," he said. "I'm going to sing back." That night, he wrote alone in his room at Graceland, candlelight flickering across a Bible open to Psalms. He scribbled lyrics on a scrap of hotel stationery. If joy is a sin, then let me sing my prayer loud. He remembered his mama's voice, soft and worn from years of factory dust. She used to say, "Sing like God's the only one listening, son." Those words burned inside him now. The next Sunday, Elvis returned to the First Assembly Church, not to argue, but to listen. He sat in the back pew, hat pulled low, while Reverend Cole preached about temptation and grace. Mid-sermon, the Reverend paused, eyes scanning the crowd. Their eyes met, neither spoke, but something shifted. A recognition that this wasn't about sin or fame anymore. It was about fear. Elvis rose quietly and left before the final hymn. Outside, the sun was blinding. Fans spotted him, calling his name, but he didn't wave. He just walked toward Beale Street, toward the place where his love of music began. The rhythm of drums, the cry of trumpets, the laughter of people spilling from cafes. It all mixed with the echoes of gospel from open church doors. That sound was home. He stopped by an old wooden church on the corner, one he used to visit as a boy. The pastor there, Reverend Amos King, recognized him instantly. "Elvis Presley," the man said with a smile. "You still hum those hymns, or has fame changed your tune?" Elvis laughed softly. "Trying to figure out what tune the Lord wants me to play." Reverend King gestured to the small stage. "Then play it here. Play what you feel." The mic crackled. The few folks inside turned their heads. Elvis sat at the upright piano, the same kind his mama once played, and began a slow, aching version of Amazing Grace. No spotlight, no screaming fans, just voice and faith, and when he finished, nobody clapped. They just stood still, eyes wet, hands clasped. Reverend King said, "Maybe that's the sermon you were meant to preach." Elvis looked down at the keys. "If the church don't believe music can praise God, I'll just have to show 'em." He smiled then, the kind of smile that hides a plan. Over the next week, rumors spread that Elvis was preparing something big. RCA studio doors stayed closed. The label kept silent, but a small group of Memphis musicians said they'd seen him rehearsing hymns with a blues band, a mix no one had ever heard before. On the night of September 3rd, 1956, the Overton Park Shell announced a surprise charity concert. Tickets sold out in 3 hours. Reporters laughed it off. Elvis is going to turn church songs into rock and roll. But Reverend Cole bought a ticket anyway. He wanted to see what kind of gospel could make the devil dance. As the lights dimmed that night and the crowd of 4,000 fell silent, a single microphone waited at center stage. The band tuned. The air trembled. Backstage, Elvis touched the silver cross around his neck. "Lord," he whispered, "let 'em hear what you meant this voice for." He walked toward the light. The crowd erupted, and somewhere in that thunder, one question still hung in the air. Was he about to save his soul, or lose it forever? September 3rd, 1956, Overton Park Shell, Memphis. The night air buzzed with heat and murmurs. Over 4,000 people packed the open-air arena, shoulder to shoulder, sweat glistening under the floodlights. Reporters jotted notes, camera flashes stuttered, and somewhere in the back, Reverend Cole sat beneath a wide-brim hat, hands folded tight like a man about to witness Judgment Day. When the stage lights cut out, the crowd screamed. Then silence. Only the hum of the amplifiers. A single spotlight hit center stage. Elvis stepped into it. White jacket, black slacks, a small silver cross resting against his collarbone. He didn't move, didn't smile, just stared out into the sea of faces. Then he said softly, "Before I start, I want to sing something my mama used to hum when times got bad." The crowd murmured. Some fans cheered, others went still. Elvis turned to the piano, touched the keys, and began singing "Peace in the Valley." His voice trembled at first, soft and unsure, like a man walking on water. No guitar twang, no drum beat, just the slow rise of his voice against the night air. Even the cicadas stopped. The words rolled out over the crowd. There will be peace in the valley for me, someday. A woman in the front row began to cry. A boy lowered his soda and whispered, "That's Elvis?" When the last note faded, the crowd didn't clap. They just stared, breath held, unsure what they'd just felt. Then came the twist. Elvis nodded to his band. The drummer lifted his sticks. The bass rumbled low, and before anyone could blink, the opening riff of Hound Dog crashed through the night. The audience exploded. People leapt from their seats. The roar shook the ground. Flashbulbs burst like lightning. But in the middle of the chaos, Elvis didn't dance. He stood still, eyes closed, one hand over his heart, as if he were praying through the noise. The band carried the rhythm, but his movements were different, reverent, almost ritual, the same song, the same voice, but something holy in it now. Reverend Cole watched from the stands, eyes wide. The crowd wasn't falling into sin. They were lifted, laughing, crying, shouting his name, not like fans but like believers. He whispered to himself, "What is this?" Elvis opened his eyes. "You call it rock and roll," he said into the mic, "but I call it joy." The place erupted again. RCA executives backstage traded worried glances. One whispered, "If he turns this into gospel, we're done." But Elvis wasn't thinking about contracts or headlines. He was thinking about his mama in that old shotgun house, her voice soft in the dark, singing through hunger. He was thinking about the priest who told him he was sinful, and the God he still talked to when nobody else was around. When the song ended, Elvis stepped back from the mic, sweat glistening on his face. The crowd screamed for more. He looked up toward the sky. "Reverend," he said quietly, "if you're here tonight, this one's for you." He motioned to the guitarist, who strummed the first notes of "I Believe." A hush spread over the arena. 4,000 people swayed as one. Even Cole couldn't stay seated. His hat slipped from his hands. When the final line came, "I believe for every drop of rain that falls, a flower grows," the Reverend's eyes filled with tears. He had come to catch a sinner. He found a preacher. The music stopped. The crowd didn't. They chanted his name, not with frenzy, but with something closer to faith. "Elvis! Elvis!" Backstage, a reporter whispered into his tape recorder. September 3rd, 1956. Overton Park, Shell. Elvis Presley sang gospel tonight, and Memphis fell silent. Elvis walked off stage without bowing. The cross around his neck gleamed in the floodlight. Charlie caught him by the curtain. "You just turned rock and roll into a sermon." Elvis smiled faintly. Maybe the church needed a new choir. The echo of the crowd chased him down the corridor. And somewhere in the dark seats, Reverend Cole whispered, "Maybe." He was right. But Elvis wasn't done proving it yet. The morning after the concert, the Memphis Gazette headline read, "Elvis brings church to rock." Some called it blasphemy. Others called it rebirth. At RCA's Nashville office, executives huddled in a glass room, smoke curling above them. One slammed his fist on the table. "He's losing the crowd. Gospel doesn't sell." But Elvis didn't care. He was done chasing charts. He showed up at Sun's studio, white shirt sleeves rolled to his elbows, that same silver cross shining under the fluorescent lights. Sam Phillips, his old producer, looked up from the console and sighed. "Elvis, you sure about this?" "Dead sure," he said. "If singing for God is wrong, I'll take the hit." Sam ran a hand through his hair. "They'll say you're repenting," Elvis grinned. "Maybe I am," the band gathered. No screaming fans, no cameras, just the quiet hum of tape rolling. Elvis leaned toward the mic and whispered, "Take it from the top." The first notes of Peace in the Valley filled the room again, softer this time. When he sang, his voice cracked, raw and real. Charlie watched from the booth, shaking his head. Never heard him sing like that before. By the end of the session, no one spoke. The tape clicked to a stop. Elvis stepped back, breathless. Sam finally said, "You just made a gospel record." Elvis smiled. Then let's put it out, RCA panicked. They delayed the release, called it a special EP, buried it between his hits. But when Peace in the Valley hit the airwaves in February 1957, the impossible happened. It climbed the charts, #3 Billboard. Church radio stations played it alongside hymns, and every penny of its earnings went to charity, most of it sent quietly to local churches and orphanages. For the first time, even his critics had to listen. The same Reverend Cole who once condemned him sat in his study, the record spinning slow on an old turntable. The crackle of vinyl filled the room, and Elvis's voice wrapped around the verse, "There will be peace in the valley for me." Cole closed his eyes. He'd wanted proof, and here it was, a sinner who sang like a saint. He lifted the needle, then lowered it again, unable to stop listening. Outside his window, the church bell rang for Sunday service. Across Memphis, record shops sold out of copies. People lined up outside Graceland, leaving letters and prayers at the gate. One note read, "Your song made my daddy forgive my brother. Thank you." Another said, "You brought my church back to life." Elvis read every single one. Some nights, he'd sit on the steps with a cup of coffee, just watching fans light candles by the gate. He'd whisper to Charlie, maybe it wasn't about music after all. Maybe it was about reminding folks how to feel. Still, the backlash never stopped. Newspapers accused him of using religion as a stunt. "The boy who danced for the devil now sings for God," one headline sneered. But Elvis stayed quiet. When a reporter asked if he'd go back to rock and roll, he said, "I never left it. I just found the part that was missing." That winter, Reverend Cole requested a meeting. It took weeks for it to happen. When he arrived at Graceland, the guard hesitated, until Elvis himself stepped out onto the porch. The Reverend carried something wrapped in cloth. "I brought you something, son." Elvis raised an eyebrow. "Didn't think you'd come back." Cole smiled sadly. "Didn't think you'd change my heart." He unwrapped the cloth to reveal a small wooden cross, carved from the pulpit that once condemned him. Elvis took it gently, tracing the grain with his thumb. "Maybe," Cole said softly. "The devil doesn't own rhythm after all." For the first time, Elvis saw tears in the old man's eyes. He nodded, voice trembling. Then were both forgiven. They stood there in silence, the faint hum of crickets rising in the Memphis air. Sometimes the loudest redemption comes with no applause at all. The sky hung low over Memphis that morning, grey as old film. Elvis stood by the window, suitcase half packed, his army papers folded neatly on the table. He was leaving for Fort Hood in just 2 days. The air inside the mansion felt heavy, like the world was pausing to breathe before saying goodbye. Charlie entered the room holding a small envelope. "You've got a visitor," he said quietly. Elvis turned. "This early?" Charlie nodded. "It's the Reverend." Elvis froze for a moment, then smiled faintly. "Let him in." Moments later, Reverend Cole stepped through the door, hat in hand, eyes soft with age. He looked thinner, gentler, as if something inside him had changed. "Elvis," he said, voice low. "I heard you're leaving." "Yes, sir. Uncle Sam says it's time." Cole chuckled. "Even kings have to serve." They both laughed, awkwardly at first, then warmly, like old friends who'd survived a storm together. Then the Reverend placed a cloth bundle on the table. "What's that?" Elvis asked. Cole unfolded it carefully, revealing a small wooden cross, polished smooth, its edges worn. "It's from the pulpit at First Assembly," he said. "The one I preached from the day I called your music sinful." Elvis ran his fingers across the wood. "You didn't have to do this, Reverend." "Yes, I did," Cole said. "I tore that pulpit down last month, built a new one. This piece," he paused, "it belongs to the man who showed me God's rhythm." For a long moment, neither spoke. The house was silent except for the ticking clock and the faint wind outside. Elvis finally whispered, "You taught me something too, Reverend. You taught me that faith doesn't break when you question it. It grows," Cole smiled. "Maybe the church needed you more than it knew." They prayed together then. No choir, no sermon, just two voices in a quiet room. After the prayer, Cole reached into his coat and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "I wrote this for you," he said. "It's a hymn. Maybe someday you'll sing it." Elvis read the first line aloud. The sinner sang, and heaven listened. He smiled. "That's beautiful," Cole nodded. "It's yours now." Elvis placed the hymn beside his army uniform. Then he looked at the Reverend, eyes glistening. "Promise me something, sir." "What's that?" "When I'm gone, don't let them forget that music can heal." The Reverend straightened his shoulders. "I'll make sure they remember." As Cole left the mansion, he stopped by the front gate. Dozens of fans had gathered, holding candles and flags, singing softly, "Peace in the Valley." He watched, tears slipping down his cheek. Inside, Elvis stood at the window watching too. "Look at that," he whispered. "They turned my song into a prayer." That week, the First Assembly Church changed its Sunday program. For the first time, the youth choir sang "Peace in the Valley." The congregation that once called it sinful now stood and clapped. Even the old ladies who once scolded teenagers for dancing swayed gently to the rhythm. It didn't sound like rebellion anymore. It sounded like redemption. Sometimes grace arrives quietly, through a song, through forgiveness, through the echo of a voice that refuses to be silenced. Elvis held the wooden cross in his hand one last time before packing it carefully into his bag. He turned to Charlie. "You think the Lord forgave me?" Charlie smiled. "Son, I think he just promoted you to choir leader." Elvis laughed softly, the sound fading into the wind. As the train whistle blew 2 days later, he looked out the window and whispered, "Keep the music playing, Lord. I'll be back." The sun hadn't risen yet when the sirens wailed down Elvis Presley Boulevard. The news spread before dawn. The king was gone. By noon, the gates of Graceland overflowed. Thousands of fans stood shoulder to shoulder, clutching flowers, vinyl records, and hymn books. Some wept, some sang softly, and through the hum of grief, one voice began to rise, a woman's voice singing "Peace in the Valley." Within minutes, the whole crowd joined her. The song that once divided a church now united a world. Inside a quiet office at First Assembly Church, an old man listened to the radio. Reverend Thomas Cole's hands trembled as Elvis's gospel played through the static. He was nearly 80 now. The same man who'd once called that music the devil's work now sat surrounded by church youth choirs rehearsing "How Great Thou Art." A small wooden plaque hung behind him, nailed to the wall in 1981. He showed us faith in every rhythm. Cole had made sure of it. In the years after that day at Graceland, he'd spent every Sunday teaching music as worship. Choirs that once feared guitars now filled the church with them. He often told the same story to new members, about a young man who taught him that faith wasn't just spoken, it was sung. There was even a framed black and white photo on his desk. Elvis, eyes closed, microphone in hand, sweat shining like rain under stage lights. Beneath it, Cole had written in his own hand, "The moment I saw the gospel dance." When people asked if he ever told Elvis how much that night changed him, he'd shake his head. Didn't need to, he'd say. He already knew. Across the ocean, churches in London, Sydney, and Cape Town began performing Elvis's gospel songs. In 1967, his How Great Thou Art album won him his first Grammy, not for rock, but for sacred music. 3 Grammys in total, all for gospel. Years later, music historians would call it the Holy Trilogy. Peace in the Valley, How Great Thou Art, and He Touched Me. But to the people who were there, it wasn't about awards. It was about redemption. One of Elvis's old microphones now sits in a glass case at the Church Museum. The inscription below it reads, "Used at Overton Park Shell, Sept 3, 1956. The night faith found a rhythm. Tourists still whisper in awe when they see it. Some leave handwritten prayers, Others press their hands to the glass and smile through tears. Outside that same church, beneath the oak tree that shades the front steps, a small cross still stands, carved from the original pulpit. The same one Reverend Cole once gave to Elvis. A woman named Sarah, who leads the church choir today, says every Easter Sunday she brings her students there to sing his gospel songs. She tells them, "Don't just sing the notes, sing what you believe." When asked if she thinks Elvis ever knew how far his voice travelled, she pauses. "Maybe not," she says, "but I think he felt it. The echo of his music still fills sanctuaries and stadiums alike. The same voice that once shook hips now shakes hearts." Sometimes people still argue about whether he was saint or sinner, but those who heard him in that Memphis night know the truth. He was just a man searching for God in a melody, because sometimes heaven doesn't sound like a choir. It sounds like a guitar, a heartbeat, and a boy from Tupelo who refused to stop singing. And maybe that's the point, that grace isn't about where you find it, but that you do. So if you ever hear Peace in the Valley play on an old radio, remember, it wasn't just a song, it was a promise. If this story moved you, share it with someone who still believes music can't be holy, because Elvis proved that faith doesn't live in silence, it lives in sound. And maybe tonight, when you hear that voice echo through static or memory, you'll understand what he meant when he said, "Music saved me.